I've seen a lot of people in my career, and, like you mentioned, you and I work together. We had people at that company, and I've had people at other companies that I've been at that essentially learned to do two things, right? In their entire careers, it seemed. And they just spent the day waiting until one of those two things that they did was needed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't teach anybody else how to do those two things so that they could move on to something new. They just knew how to do those two things. And when they were needed, then they would do one of those two things. And then they would wait for the next time that they were needed. And I always thought that seemed somehow like mentally painful to be in that position. And so I always took it upon myself to say, I'm going to be the guy who can learn new things and then teach other people to do it so that I can move on and learn the next new thing, instead of being the person who just learns something and then just does that for a prolonged period of time. So I was thinking about this a lot today, and I would say that my first love was web development.
Mm-hmm.
Really old school, old-fashioned web development back in 1995, when things were very first, the web was very first coming to life. When I was in undergrad during 1995, I had one of the very first, if not maybe the first, student websites at Illinois Wesleyan University. And that was really my first real foray into producing code that other people could see, right? Outside of classroom code that you just sort of handed in for a grade. And so that was really cool. And I ended up teaching some classes there, more informally, to clubs, to other students, to even to some of the professors there. I gave classes on how to do website development because it was just so new for everybody. And then I would say from there, I ended up going to grad school at U of I. And the thing that really caught my interest at U of I down in Champaign was virtual reality. So I made that was sort of like the first big shift in my area of focus for development, was to move into virtual reality. So I worked in what they call the Cave Lab down there, which is it's essentially a room made of projection screens, rear projection screens. And you would stand in the room wearing liquid crystal shutter glasses, just like active 3D TVs work nowadays. And, you'd be immersed in this 3D world. And so that was a really cool experience, because the stuff that we were building there was like what we did. We were the first people on Earth to do some of the things that we did there. And that was a really cool experience as a grad student. When I left grad school and got a job, I transitioned back to, like .NET development, web development, client server, that type of stuff, mostly because VR wasn't really a thing that you could do for a living back then. It didn't catch on until, much more recently, obviously. And so I spent several years doing .NET development, web development. Subsequent to that, I've had a couple of startup companies. One startup company was doing home automation hardware and software. I did web development there. I did development on the device level development.
But was that still .NET?
The web development was .NET, but the device level development was not, right? Like that was working in Linux, writing, code to run specifically on the device.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of experience there. And then also we, as a front end for that device, we built an engine that could run Lua code. So I spent a good amount of time writing Lua code as well, which was a whole different thing, because that was essentially code that you would write sort of feeling like JavaScript or some other programming languages, but it would, translate it down into something that the device itself could run as well. So lots of a variety of experiences there, which is one of the reasons why you go to a startup company, to wear a lot of different hats and get a lot of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, I had another startup company, and we were doing essentially mobile interfaces for online forums. And so an online forum is, where people go to discuss dogs or baseball or cars or, whatever subject areas of interest to them. And that's a really antiquated space. And so what we were doing was building mobile browser and mobile native applications to make those experiences better for a mobile device. Right. So you wouldn't come to someone's forum on your phone and get their desktop site. You'd come to their forum on your phone, either through an app or in a browser, and you'd get a experience that was designed to perfectly fit your phone, right? Like a pixel perfect mobile experience, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that experience, there was a lot of web development still for that, but then also development for iPhone, development for Android, again, at a startup company, you wear a lot of hats. So doing all of those different things and having those experiences. That startup company actually ended up getting acquired. And so I worked for the company that acquired us for about a year and a half. And we had an office in the West Loop in Chicago, and we had a screen running in our lobby that showed Google Analytics. And I walked in one morning and it had rolled over 1 billion page views. And I just sort of decided in that moment, you know what, I'm good with that. That was what I had set out to achieve, was building this successful application, getting it on a whole bunch of forums and getting a lot of users to use it. And so at that moment, I started looking for what the next thing would be. And this is when I ended up making the more significant shift or more radical shift from development into data and analytics.
So far we're like 1995 through what year are we talking now?
Oh, it's a tough one. It's got to be 2012, give or take.
Okay.
Yeah, 2014 maybe.
So like almost 20 years of web development at this point.
Yeah, it's getting close to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably 15 years of web development and, some client server and some mobile development thrown in there. And then a switch for the last 4.5 years or so to this data and analytics. And I always say I got into data analytics accidentally on purpose. And by that, I mean, I actually went to a company for an interview to be the director of mobile development. And so I was like, okay, I've been doing mobile development at, the startup company and the company that acquired us. And I wanted to, I thought that I wanted to continue doing mobile development. That was all the rage at the time. It still is all the rage, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. But in talking with the CIO, I had a really interesting interview with him. So we spoke, we spoke for an hour, give or take. And 45 minutes of that was just pure, hey, this is the mobile director of mobile job. Here's the things that you'd be responsible for. Tell me about your experiences, blah, blah, blah. Standard interview type stuff. And the last 15 minutes, he kind of got this thought in his head because of our conversation. When we were doing the forum software, we were working a lot with ad tech, so ad technology.
Right.
And that was part of the idea, right? We would insert ads into this mobile experience and we would share the revenue with the forum owners. That was the business model for the startup. So we did an awful lot with Google Analytics and other tools to do A/B testing, to track the success of different ads, different placements of ads from different companies, a lot of sort of embedding ads to make them look more like their articles instead of just having them sort of floating and be obviously ads, all that type of stuff that you do when you're doing ad technology. And, I was telling him about that stuff and this thought came to him in the last 15 minutes where he had a pipe dream essentially of creating a true data and analytics center of excellence for that company. And he wanted to talk to me about that. He's like, so what are your thoughts on data and analytics? And I was like, well, I guess they're really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it so much, but I had done a lot of it just sort of inherently because it was of interest to me.
Right.
So we talked for the last 15 minutes of the interview about that other opportunity that could be there. It wasn't something that they had a job posted for or anything like that. It was just something that, he had been thinking a lot about. And that's common at a lot of companies, right? A lot of companies are thinking about data and analytics and what could they possibly do with data and analytics. And so literally the next day, I got a call from the recruiter from that company saying, hey, we'd like to offer you the job, but we'd like to offer you the job to be the director of data and analytics, not the director of mobile. And my response was just, great, can you send me the job description? Right? And so it was just a funny experience where I at the time I had interviewed with a different startup company as well. And I had a job offer there and it was doing mobile development. And so I was comparing and contrasting the two. And I said, you know what? I know a decent amount about data and analytics conceptually. I can't say that I understand all the tools right now. I don't necessarily understand Hadoop and, Tableau and Power BI and all the different tools that you use for data and analytics. But I know that I can learn those, right? And I have a large amount of intellectual curiosity and a desire to learn. So I ended up taking that opportunity without really knowing so much what I was getting myself into and making that switch. And I think for me, it was kind of a trial by fire, right? It was just jumping in and saying, you know what, I got to rapidly learn all this stuff. And I think that in today's day and age, there's so much material available on the internet, either to read or YouTube videos. There's so many conferences, even a ton of free conferences. There's just so much available that there's no excuse to not get out there and learn stuff. And so I was able to pretty rapidly go from attending these conferences to speaking at some of the conferences as well, based on my experiences, because people at that time wanted opinions from people who weren't necessarily, going out there saying, oh, I've been doing data and analytics for 10 years and this is how you do it and stuff. They wanted opinions from people who were like starting off and using the most cutting edge technologies at the time and trying to implement all those, and the cultural shift that needs to take place within a company to switch to be a data-driven company, that sort of thing. So there was a strong interest, even in the people who were just brand new to it, sharing their experiences and how they were learning and that type of thing. And I will say, local conferences, if you live near a big city, like, I live near Chicago, that's a great resource. And I think even more important than going to the conference and listening to the people speak is to talk to all the other people that are there and hear their stories and really pay attention to these real world implementations that they're doing. Because it's one thing to learn the technology and to learn all the theories. It's another thing to understand like the practical application of it. Like, how can you actually take all those theories and make it into reality? Because you're not, in that capacity, you're not trying to teach someone how to do it. You're trying to actually do it, right? So it's not like being in school and learning theories. It's being in the real world and learning real implementations and how to make it successful.
Okay, so let's stop here, because I think you've said a whole bunch of things. There's a lot to unpack, basically, in what you said. And just listening to your story, I hear a few things, which are patterns that I hear over and over again in people that have successful careers as developers. So let's go kind of backwards. The last thing that you said, well, I guess you were last talking about conferences and speaking at conferences. So let's start there. You mentioned even at the beginning in like 95 when you were doing web development that was, you were obviously very enthusiastic about that, very excited about that. And then you started running little sessions and presentations, workshops, teaching people how to do some of the stuff that you did. And I know we worked together for like 4 years, something like that. And that was a common, that was something you did even then when I worked with you, was you were teaching people and taking the time to teach people. And that was a high priority for you, was teaching people. So is that a pretty common thread for you through your career?
Yeah. And I think there's definitely a couple reasons for it. One is that I think that you learn by teaching as well. So whatever it is that you think you know, when you attempt to teach it to someone, you're going to learn it better. And if you really pay attention to that person or those people that you're trying to teach and their thoughts on it, that can really help you understand it better as well. So that's part of it. Part of it is just the enjoyment of teaching. Like, I've always enjoyed teaching and sharing knowledge. I've seen a lot of people in my career, and, like you mentioned, you and I worked together. We had people at that company, and I've had people at other companies that I've been at that essentially learned to do two things, right? In their entire careers, it seemed. And they just spent the day waiting until one of those two things that they did was needed, right? Mm-hmm. And they didn't teach anybody else how to do those two things so that they could move on to something new. They just knew how to do those two things. And when they were needed, then they would do one of those two things, and then they would wait for the next time that they were needed. And I always thought that seemed somehow like mentally painful to be in that position. And so I always took it upon myself to say, I'm going to be the guy who can learn new things and then teach other people to do it so that I can move on and learn the next new thing, instead of being the person who just learns something and then just does that for a prolonged period of time. So I think that's a piece of it as well.
Sure. Well, okay. So there's learning for the sake of learning, because I just know you, and know you have a natural enthusiasm for learning new things. So there's that. And then there's these benefits that you're talking about. I think, well, let's go back to speaking again. So when you were recommending that people go to meetups and talk at meetups, when someone goes to a meetup, you also recommended that they speak with the people there at the meetup. And you said another thing, which was that they should strive to understand the why behind all the tooling and skills and things like that they're learning. Mm-hmm. And all right, so a couple things there. First is, well, I'll just make a comment. And I feel like when you go to a meetup or a conference, one of the best ways to meet and talk with other people is to speak at the conference or speak at the meetup. In fact, I find it's the only way, honestly. It's really tough. There's certainly a personality that could pop into a meetup randomly and connect with a lot of people. Yeah, that can definitely happen. I think though that's pretty rough. That could sometimes be a pretty rough situation to show up in a meetup, you don't know anybody, and to try and make connections and have serious conversations about businessy stuff. That doesn't always happen. But and I know that, again, there's people that can do that. But when I go to a meetup or a conference and I speak, I always end up having those conversations with people and meeting new people and making friends. That's pretty much a given. Okay, I also wanted to talk about the thing that you do, apparently, naturally, which is to seek out the why behind what people do. So what's really interesting about what happened with the shift into data analytics is what a lot of people run into in this industry is job descriptions, HR, hiring managers. The way they tend to go about this is to create a list of skills that they need, for the job description. And in your case, and I guess if you don't have those skills, if you're not like a match to those skills, you get weeded out somewhere in the beginning of the process a lot of the time. And
Right.
in your case, they literally did not have a job description. And then they kind of wrote the job description for you. I'm assuming that was kind of part of the deal. It was a little bit of a negotiation. But in a sense, you were really hired to solve a business problem, even though you didn't have the technical skills. Please tell me more about that, because that's like the magic. That's the thing that I think everybody needs to strive for in their career, is to get to that point.
Yeah. So I have a few things to say about that. So I've been really lucky in my career that I've done that twice, right? So at that company, I was able to help write the job description essentially after having those conversations and deciding that, yes, that was something I was very, very much interested in. Subsequent to that, when I switched to a different company, a friend of mine who I had been working with at the prior company went to work at this new company, and they were talking about data and analytics at the new company. And she asked if I could come in and help them understand what they could do with data and analytics. And so I took that as an opportunity to say, hey, let me try and expand my network of people. Let me try and expand my knowledge by working with another company. And I wasn't looking to get a job there or anything. I just said, you know what? I know some stuff. I've talked to a lot of people. I've put together a lot of plans around business cases and technical architecture and all those sort of things. Let me just go to this company and I'll meet with their CIO and their IT folks and that sort of thing, and just tell them what the possibilities are, how much it'll cost, the types of benefits that they can get from data and analytics, and help them build their business case to create a center of excellence there. And so I ended up doing that. And part of that is just seizing that opportunity when it comes to you, right? Not everybody's going to get that opportunity, but they weren't offering to pay me or anything like that. It was just something that, hey, this is a really good opportunity to go and share some of that information, similar to going and talking at a conference, right? You're not going to get paid to go there or a meetup. It's about networking. It's about putting yourself out there. It's about meeting new people, learning, teaching, all of that stuff.
Sure. So there was some luck involved in that opportunity.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But you surely did some things deliberately which created that opportunity for that luck to happen. What do you think you did to make it so that conversation happened? How did that new conversation happen that you were just talking about?
Well, I think I've always strived to do a really good job of whatever it is that I'm doing, right? And so that people that I work with recognize me as someone who can do a really good job at whatever it is, whatever the task at hand is. And so that's part of how you build up your network, right? If you're at a company and you form really good relationships, both personally and professionally, with the people that you work with, when they move on, then they're likely to reach out to you for different things. So that's an intentional thing there, that you want to be seen as being a very high caliber professional individual, right? And so in this case, the person who went to this new company knew that I was good at what I did, and that, she thought that I could come in and help this other company, decide what they wanted to do. In the end, in that situation, I ended up essentially helping them create their business plan. They got the COE approved. This took several months. They came back to me and actually asked me to write the job description for the director of the Center of Excellence. So I wrote that for them, and they posted it. And when they posted it, they contacted me again and just said, would you like to actually be the director of the Center of Excellence. And so that's what I ended up doing. The company that I was at kind of financially imploded. I'm not going to go into too many details, but it was time to leave. Most of IT left from that prior company. And it wasn't anybody in IT's fault or anything like that. It was just the market and the business that company was in at the time. So it worked out really well timing wise to move on to the next thing. And it also worked out to be able to sort of define what it was that I was moving into. So again, a little bit of luck involved in that, but the key thing is like building and working your network, right? So I'm not going to sit here. I mean, I've been turned down for so many jobs. I always get turned down when I send out my resume cold, right? So if I go on Indeed or LinkedIn or whatever, and I find jobs that sound interesting and I send them my resume, inevitably 9 times out of 10, they say, no, thanks, right? Because either a human being isn't even looking at it, to your point, right? They're looking for specific keywords. Or if a human being is looking at it, they're acting like they are a computer, where they're just looking for specific keywords. And it's someone from in recruiting who doesn't actually really understand what it takes to be a successful leader or a successful developer or whatever, and doesn't understand that you show a clear track record of being able to learn and be successful.
Yes.
And so I think the key there is to get past that initial step, right? So use tools like LinkedIn, build your network, keep in touch with all the people that you've worked with and for, and people who have worked for you over the years, and use that network. Always be willing to help others, right? When they're in search of a job, and don't be afraid to ask for help from others when you're in search of a job, because if you can get your foot in the door and show them that you have this track record of success, no matter what the technology stack is, that's how you can start to jump around, right? You don't always have to leave companies. You can sometimes, depending on the company, you can position yourself as, like I said earlier, the person who figures out things and then teaches other people how to do them so that you can go and figure out the next thing. That's a little bit rare, I've found. At companies, they like it when you're this type of developer, and it's easy for us to put you in a box and sort of understand your career path and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit rare, but it definitely can happen. And so that's one way to go about it. But the other way to go about it is just to not be afraid to make a change, right? I've made several changes in my career. And like I said, had a couple different startup companies. I've done consulting. I've worked for really large companies, worked for really small companies, a couple different industries, whether it be like logistics or education or automation or software or whatever, various different things. And a lot of those decisions were very intentional to say, I want this depth and breadth of experience so that I can have that moving forward, because it's of interest to me. I was just never really interested in doing one thing and just getting to be like really, really, really good at that one thing and doing that until I retired.
Yeah. Hey, so another thing you said earlier was that you also strive to do a really good job when you're given a task, when you're given something to do at a job. So you try and do the best job that you can. So that way, when those people that you're working with on that project or at that company move on, they remember you as the guy that did a really fantastic job. And we loved working with Craig. He was amazing. Mm-hmm. We should hire him here, right? Okay, so I've worked with plenty of people that do a fine job at their job. They get it done. They, write code. It's good. Features ship. They're not behind. And of course, we've all worked with the person that's shipping nothing or shipping extremely buggy code all the time, putting no effort into getting better. But there are just these loads of these people in this middle ground where, well, sure, like if a position, if a client was looking for somebody for a particular project, there are loads of people that I've worked with that maybe are qualified to do that, but I wouldn't immediately think, yes, Joe, he's the guy. Instead it would be like, yeah, he'd do it. It'd be fine. But instead I'd reach for the person that did a really good job. So what I want to ask you is, what do you do to do a really good job? What's the definition to you of doing a really good job on a project?
So there's the stuff that's just table stakes, right? Like you got to deliver high quality code on time. That's number one. But a lot of it has to do with the relationship building. So I remember when you and I worked together at the company that we worked at, I spent a good amount of time talking with people around the department. And I remember I had an annual review one year, and the only negative thing that was in my review, it said, Craig spends too much time talking to people. And, back then we were at that particular company, we were allowed to write a rebuttal to our review. So I wrote a couple paragraph rebuttal explaining why I was doing that, why I was talking to people, with my argument being I had seen a need at that company to start a standards group because we had so many new hires coming out of college and so many people coming into the company, like literally hundreds of people over the 8 years that I was there, that they didn't have any programming standards. They didn't have any software development lifecycle documentation. They didn't have anything like that, security standards, anything. And so finding opportunities where you see a need and just jumping in and figuring out how to fill that need is a way to show that you're, I don't know what the word is, better than the average bear, let's say, or smarter than the average bear. So that's part of it, right? Like don't just focus on the one thing that you've been asked to do. Try and figure out how you can expand your influence to others, right? Not just your own work, but if you're the type of person that can make an entire team better, that reflects very highly on you versus just the person who churns out his own really good code. So in that context, I had, worked with a couple of project managers there, and we had founded the standards group, and I ran that for 7 years when I was there, wrote all the programming standards, the software development lifecycle documentation, reviewed every bit of code that the department wrote, all that sort of stuff. And the point, going back to my original point, the reason why I was spending a lot of time talking to people was because I didn't want my only interaction with people to be when they came to a code review and I told them what they were doing wrong, right? I needed to form personal relationships with everybody in the department so that I knew that they knew that I was there as their friend, trying to help them be better and do a good job. I wasn't there because I just enjoyed critiquing people, right? And so that actually led to the following year when I got my review, they had their own retraction in that review saying, you know what, we were wrong last year. What you're doing is exactly correct. You should be building these relationships because that's how you get people to trust you and know you and listen to you, right? Because the standards group that we created was a completely grassroots movement. It wasn't an official entity within the company that the management was saying, people had to listen to. But I think that's a piece, right? The table stakes, yes, you got to deliver good code. You got to deliver it with high quality. You got to deliver it on time. But you have to figure out where are the little areas that I can do just that little bit more here and that little bit more there, build this relationship here, build this relationship there to stand out above everybody else. And I think that's the key. And then people see that and they say, you know what, I've got this position, Joe, to your point, Joe isn't exactly a fit to it, but I remember working with Joe was so awesome. And I remember that Joe picked up all these extra things and was able to do much more than I ever asked him for or anybody ever asked him for. And so I'm going to give him a shot in this new role, even though it doesn't exactly fit his experience. Right. And so it's really about those smaller side things and the extra stuff that you can do on top of just, spitting out the best code that you can.
I think, and also a key thing there is the problem you were solving you didn't pull it out of your ass. Like you were actually noticing something that was happening in the business that would improve things for your managers, for your team members, if you proactively went after it and tried to work on it and improve things. Like that's a really key thing. And it's the same pattern that you have of looking at the business and trying to figure out the why behind the tech. So I know you have always been super interested in the tech, and that's probably never going to change for you. But at the same time, the thing that's way different about you, I think, and I think why you've been so successful is you're looking at the business and the reason for why you're doing something. You're actively helping.
Sure.
And also building real relationships along the way.
Yeah, and I think that the key for me is that it's always been an honest. The last few days and now talking to you is the most I've ever thought about why I do things.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's always been just an honest effort to say, what can I do to make things better, right? What can I do to make Joe successful? What can I do to make company A successful? It hasn't been like a calculated thing to say, oh, if Craig does this, then I'll be able to do this. And then 4 years from now, this person will do something that'll help me out. Or, it's never been like a calculation like that. It's just been what's of interest to me. What's the most useful thing that I could be doing? That type of stuff.
Sure.
And I think that's part of it too, because I think people see through it if you're doing it from a position of personal gain. I think people see through that and they're like, oh, that he's not really being honest and about that. He's just doing it because he's looking to get ahead.
Sure. But I think it can be deliberate. Like,
yeah, Deliberate, yes.
Sure. Like any business is essentially out for personal gain. So people should, be turned off by businesses all the time, but we're not, right? Some of them you can, but there are businesses that we are naturally turned off by because you could tell that their intentions are not good. But I think the difference is, for those businesses that don't mind giving our money to, it's because they understand our problems. They understand how they're helping us, how they fit into our lives, what they do to make our lives better. And that's all you're doing too. And I do believe that it can be deliberately done. Like people listening to this podcast can hear what you did and they can apply this deliberately and it won't come off as self-centered, right? Because what we're saying is look at the problems that the people around you have, that the company that you're working for has, that your managers have. Understand that. So essentially you're listening really carefully to people and how they're feeling and what problems they're dealing with and understanding as best you can what those problems are and then solving that. And yeah, you could do that because I would like to gain more trust. I would like to have a better position in the company. I would like to have a better network of people because, those can be in the back of your mind. I don't think that makes then pursuing those opportunities to help the company deliberately any less effective in terms of helping your career, nor do I think that it would affect the way people would feel about it. I mean, like if you're trying to this is not like a shortcut to success. It's not.
No, you're actually creating more work for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree. I think you can be intentional about it. And I'm not saying that I wasn't intentional about it in terms of like knowing that it would be good for me if I did something good for the company or I did something good for individuals within the company. But I think that you also have to have like a desire to be helpful too, right? Like it's very difficult to be helpful if you don't actually have a desire to be helpful.
Right.
Right. And it comes off as sort of a lot of self-promotion and stuff like that if you don't do it right. So it's just finding that balance of, yes, you are doing it so that you can derive some personal benefit, but you have to honestly be wanting to help other people as well.
Yeah. Well, like you're doing this podcast. This is a perfect example of something that you would say yes to, which a lot of people would say no to. And, this may equal an opportunity for you in the future. Maybe not, who knows, but this is a perfect example. Like sure. You said yes, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. I always say, for better or worse, I have a lot of opinions on things, and I like to talk about them. So,
all right, man. Thanks so much for doing this. I think I'm going to wrap us up here because I think we hit a lot of really good points.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Thank you, Sean.